Imam Bashir, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.
How's everything going?
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. It's good to have you on and hopefully explore your story, a unique one from what I've heard. Inshallah, let's get right into it. Today you're the Imam at Wasqab Islamic Center, Masjid Al Furqan in Marietta. And we want to know about your early upbringing. We want to know what the family dynamic was, kind of growing up, what the early influences are, and then what is the next step that you take that I want to be a student of knowledge and I want to take this a little bit further.
Bismillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah. So I was born, I like to say I was born in the last millennium, in the last century, when you write years still with 19 something. So I was born in the mid 70s, 1974 to be precise, in Nigeria. My family is from Nigeria. And I, of course, started my schooling in Nigeria firstly with my parents because I come from a family of scholarship. Both my late father, my late mother were both educators. They were educators, and my dad was an Islamic scholar and a scholar of Arabic. And my mother was a scholar of Arabic as well. Actually, my mother was the first female Arabic teacher in the public schools in my state, Niger State, in northern Nigeria. And my father was the first person from my state to get a PhD in Arabic. I studied in Libya, both of them actually. So I started primary school, we call it primary school in Nigeria, elementary school here. I started primary school I believe it was in the late 70s. I have very little memory of my very early years because I used to follow my mom to school where she would teach. But I also started Quranic learning from that very early age. I would accompany my older siblings to the madrasa, which was headed by or founded by a man who would later become the chief imam of my town, my city, Mina, in Niger State. His name was Sheikh Malam Halilu Yammakaranta, which means Malam Halilu, who had, the school teacher, basically. He was also a colleague of my mother. They both taught Islamic studies in the primary school in those years. And then I later on, more seriously, really started to learn Quran with my parents. My mother, in particular, was basically in charge of teaching me Quran. So I started learning at my mother's feet, and I'm always very grateful for that. Uh, at about the age of 7, a family came to the United States when my dad came to do his master's. So we lived in the Northeast, in the New York, New Jersey area. And of course, education continued. Then we were enrolled in Sister Clara Muhammad School, which was an African American Muslim school, predominantly African American, from the community that used to be Nation of Islam until the transition in 1975 with Imam W.D. Muhammad, Allah yarhamhu, into mainstream, Islam. So I attended Sister Clara Muhammad School in Newark, New Jersey. And up until when we went back to Nigeria, after my dad finished his studies, we went back to Nigeria. I believe that was in 82 or 83. And I continued primary school in Nigeria, skipped a grade, went straight into secondary school at about the age of 10 or so. I was very, very little, very young guy, the youngest in my class. And so both my secular education and my Islamic education were basically run in parallel like that. So I was not in a full-time Islamic school or madrasa, but in the evenings we'll go to the madrasa, or my dad would employ a muallim. We call them malam in Nigeria. Malam really just means muallim, to come and teach us, at home. So I learned, that way. And even during holidays, I would spend a lot of my time learning Quran. So I didn't have a lot of leisure like my other friends, and that's why I'm probably one of the few Nigerians you'll ever meet who is not very good at soccer. I learned soccer later in life, but all my colleagues, everybody will go play soccer, and I would be at home studying Quran or even traveling. My dad will say, "Oh, carry your Quran with you," and he will put a big whip on the dashboard, which he hardly ever had to use, but it was always there, staring at you. And I used to feel I'm not having fun like other kids, but of course now I really appreciate that. So I was doing my Islamic education like that, and of course in at school we did Islamic studies, we learned Arabic, and things like that. And I also was attending a weekend Islamic school at the Islamic Education Trust in Mina, which was founded by Sheikh Ahmed Lemu, Aisha Lemu, who were very famous Muslim scholars globally, and were basically like parents to me as well, because I basically we grew up in that environment, and they were very close to my family. So I came back to America in 1987. This time, of course, I went to high school in Philadelphia. Again, Sister Clara Muhammad School in Philadelphia. So I was learning Islamic studies in school, actually. I did not, you know, go off to just do exclusive Islamic studies necessarily. So that was a kind of, orientation that I had. And I was exposed early on to some great thinkers, even from a very young age, like Professor Ismail Faruqi, late Ismail Faruqi, who was a great Muslim intellectual. And because I was in Philadelphia, you had all these intellectual powerhouses there in the Philadelphia area, and even my guardians that I stayed with were students of his at Temple University. So I finished high school in 1990, and I went back to Nigeria. My dad insisted I must come home to do my bachelor's so that I would not lose too much of my culture, my identity, and knowing my extended family and the language and all of that. And he said, come back home to Nigeria, do your bachelor's, and after that, you can go anywhere in the world, I don't mind. So I got admission at the Federal University of Technology in Mina, which was my town. And, I enrolled, and I majored in physics with computer science. Um, and that was largely inspired by my having read, while I was in high school, having read the book, The Bible, the Quran, and Science by Dr. Maurice Bucaille, the French physician. And so that really got me very interested in astronomy in particular. I always loved the sciences. I really used to love biology, and I was very confused as to what I wanted to be. Some days I want to be a lawyer, I want to be a doctor, I want to be an astronomer, I want to be an architect. But all of that, there was inspiration of you know, helping Islam with such knowledge. So I went to the Federal University of Technology, Mina, and I majored in physics because that was the closest thing to astronomy. And I was disappointed that throughout I didn't do any astronomy in that level in the Nigerian university. But it exposed me to other things as well, such as quantum physics, for example, which I found very fascinating. And I could relate it a lot with Islam. And I was very involved in a lot of Dawah activities. I was active with the Muslim Student Society. At first I was a Dawah coordinator. Then I became the Amir. I became the president of the Muslim Student Society. And that really fueled a lot of my activism and my learning. Uh, so myself and some friends used to watch a lot of Ahmadiyya tapes, basically transcribe them, Then later it was Sheikh Jamal Badawi, his series on on Islam, basically transcribing those, spending long hours and spending the nights even at the library of the Islamic Education Trust with my good friend and brother Sheikh Nuruddin Lemu and others. Will study throughout the nights and things like that. So in terms of you know, hardcore Islamic education, my path was not very similar to the paths of most people perhaps that you will see as imams. My path was not like that, and I. I like I tell people I say I think I'm an accidental imam. you know. So after my bachelor's degree, is when I now came back to the United States, and I lived here for another, I think about 7 to 9 years or so, mostly in the Atlanta area. I worked. I was involved in a lot of dawah activities here. I got involved very early on. We were the first set of speakers for the Islamic Speakers Bureau (ISB). We did our first training literally I think a couple months literally before 9/11 happened. So it was as if we were ready to go and start speaking to different audiences about Islam, schools, high schools, universities, police departments, churches, synagogues, etc. And then I became sort of like a freelance khatib or imam in the Atlanta area. Um, Gave my first khutbah in the Atlanta area at Masjid Omar bin Abdul Aziz. It was a very small structure, and then later on I started going to different masajid, Masjid Medina, off of Jimmy Carter, and then the Masjid Al Hidayah in those days, which is now more than one community. And I would go to Birmingham, Alabama, to the Muslim community there to give lectures, all over the place, Portland, Oregon, Chicago, New York, and so on. And throughout all of these, of course, you had to, increase your knowledge. And I would take lessons from scholars, even over the phone. You know, I remember taking like a whole semester's worth of material from Professor Rashid Naim after 9/11. And that's his area, the Middle East and conflict, etc. And I remember one phone call where he basically gave me a crash course on the Middle East conflict over the phone. And I used to take a lot of copious notes. Um, and of course, uh, my learning continued with my dad as well. I learned some Arabic from him, although I'm ashamed to say that I didn't learn enough. So I did that, and I had a lot of influences, scholars who some I was close to, some it was more from a distance, but they really influenced my intellectual development a lot. Of course, I would say in the beginning years there was Ahmed Didat, and then later on scholars like Sheikh Jamal Badawi, who I respect so much. I always wanted to be like Jamal Badawi. And then later on was people like Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, for example. I was really very inspired by his scholarship, and I was really motivated by that. Even though I was never close to him, I had met him personally a couple of times. But then there were others. Perhaps I would say one of those that has influenced me the most is my beloved Sheikh Mukhtar Maghrawi, who I got to spend time with and to know more up close and personal. And I used to attend his Tazkiyah retreats at the Adirondacks Mountains in upstate New York. Those had profound, profound impact on me, not just intellectually, because he's a deeply, deeply intellectual person, uh, and a well-rounded and balanced, scholar with very good deep understanding of usul and maqasid and things in the shari sense, but also in terms of personal akhlaq and and how to be and from the qalb perspective. So I was very influenced and deeply influenced by that. And after spending close to a decade here, I went back to Nigeria because I had to go support my father, who, due to age and health, needed me nearby. So I basically dropped everything I was doing. I abandoned everything. I hadn't finished my studies, and I just dropped everything and went back. And I started to work with the Islamic Education Trust as assistant director of the Dawah Institute, which is under the auspices of Islamic Education Trust. And during that time, also, I was part of those who established the Development Initiative of West Africa, which is an Islamic faith based humanitarian NGO. Um, and so my experiences at the Dawah Institute and Islamic Education Trust really enriched me a lot because we were involved in a lot of initiatives, a lot of educational initiatives. I was involved in developing educational courses and programs for the Dawah Institute. So teaching trainers, actually, we were training trainers. We were producing material to train people in how to do dawah and how to address a lot of uh, controversial issues, and how to basically boost the self-esteem of Muslims. And that work continues, till today. But I officially worked with the Islamic Education Trust for 4 years, and throughout that time, I was also very involved in a lot of other dawah initiatives and things. Um, and then, of course, I now moved to Abuja, which is the capital city, to work in facilities management at one of the biggest boarding secondary schools in Nigeria. So I was a facilities manager in charge of basically every, the maintenance and care of all the building facilities, the vehicles, the generators, the water tankers, water reservoirs, and boreholes and carpentry and welding and all of that. But of course, I always had that, passion for Islam and intellectual things. And I was there for about 4.5 years until I now went and, I joined some friends who had established a school, and I joined as a partner, as a part owner of the school, and as the CEO, running the school called the Inspire Academy, which is an Islamically oriented school that runs on a British Nigerian curriculum, of which I'm still a part. I'm a board member and a part owner, even though I'm no longer the head of the administration. Until I now came back in 2018, I always felt I needed to come back, complete my studies. So basically, after about 11 years or so, I came back, started the master's all over again, and this time, of course, was in religion. And once I completed that in 20, I actually completed that in 2021. Took me an extra year, and I now enrolled in a PhD. And then gladly I finished 2 years ahead of allotted time. So I did that in 3 years instead of 5 years. So I was able to basically complete the master's and PhD in about 5.5 years or something like that. Also in religion at the University of Georgia. So again, there, my main professors were Professor Honerkamp, Kenneth Abdul Hadi Honerkamp, and Professor Alan Godless, or Alan Abdul Haq Godless, um, who I benefited tremendously from also intellectually, and others as well that I interacted with. Um, there are some scholars also who have been a big influence on me, like Sheikh Professor Jasir Auda, especially with regards to appreciating and understanding maqasid of Sharia and things to do with usul and really visioning a future for Islam that is universal, that speaks to that speaks to contemporary challenges and contemporary visions. So he's also been a big influence and encouragement and motivation really for me as well. Um, and yes, so while I was doing my master's, COVID, hit majorly around February of 2020, and I was living in Athens, and everything had gone online. So I requested to come and stay here at the Imam house to have a peaceful, quiet place where I can work on my thesis and finish my writing. And the board said fine. And then soon after that, I was approached. Hey, we need an imam. Though I know that because they had been speaking to me over some time. That even while I was in Nigeria, because I've known the community, for long. That we need an imam, etc. So it just so happened these things converge, and I only came here trying to spend a couple weeks, and then here I am. I think someone asked me how long I've been imam here. When I answered them, I was shocked that you know, this is my fifth year here. And it's like, wow, the time really flew by. So, in a nutshell, that's my very boring, story up to this point, in a nutshell.
Not boring in the least. It was a good story throughout. So I want to ask you, we've had many guests on, and a lot of them and many people when we think of imam, it's someone who somewhere between middle school and high school they took off 3 years to go full time hifz, and then maybe after high school or after college they went full time to Medina or to Qahira, or they went to some full time madrasa Islamic seminary, and then they come back to America or they come back home and then they become an imam, or then they start to serve the community with whatever da'wah work they're doing. Your journey, it seems, in primary school, in what we would call middle school, high school going, there's always some sort of balance. There's never, oh, I'm a full-time Islamic studies student for from ages 12 to 15, or I am a full-time madrasa student from ages 22 to 26. It's always a little bit of both. Tell me, kind of looking back, what that did for you, and if you would change it, or what that experience was balancing both of them, because that is a very tough thing to do.
Looking back, I think that all in all, I appreciate that background because from very early on, I think it gave me a sense of balance and a sense of context with everything I was learning. I was always in, you know, the reality and real situations. Um, Having schooled in Nigeria as well, and Nigeria is a multi faith country, it's a majority Muslim country, no doubt, but there's a huge Christian population as well. And some people say it's about 50-50. There's slightly more Muslims than Christians, no doubt. All the population indicators and all the, even CIA projections or World Bank projections show that clearly. But there's always an environment where you're dealing with people of various faiths, for example. I have some extended family members who are Christian, for example. Um, so you're always in that situation. So you are not sort of insulated from the reality of the world around you. Um, what it does is that it makes your learning, it's not full blown intense for a short period of time where you're able to cover a lot, but it's sort of spread out. Um, So you're kind of, and I guess in a ways, I mean, this is not to compare myself with them, but the way the Sahaba they learned piecemeal like this, and imbibing, and and then learning gradually like that. Um, yes, sometimes I did, and I did have some attempts that just didn't work out. Then what, to go off to Mecca, Medina, or Morocco at one point. After Morocco actually was, while I was in secondary school, uh, and then after college, you know. But wallahu alam, those initiatives never really worked out, and then I just kept being pushed in Western academia, so to speak. But I listened to scholars a lot, and I learned from them a lot, and I also um, appreciate uh, my limitations. You know, um, so I'm very very cognizant of that, and I've always had this sort of broad approach to understanding Islam. Alhamdulillah, I believe so. Um, in fact, I recall that when I was approached about being imam here, I was objecting to it, and I was like, I'm not trained to be an imam. I'm not your traditional imam. When I told them that, they said, well, that's why we want you to, we want someone with different kind of perspective and things like that. They felt that I was able, I could relate to youth very well. I could relate to the context of here very well. Um, Also, um, there was a feeling that um, it was a good way of promoting the diversity that Islam requires of us to respect. That people can see an imam in a masjid that's predominantly Desi and Arab, but is not Desi or Arab, right? This is a black person, and he's Nigerian, and so I kind of sort of uh, I'm able to relate well with people of diverse backgrounds. So with African Americans, with Africans, because we have people from so many other African countries, from Morocco, from Ghana, from Gambia, Senegal, Nigeria, Uganda, Somalia, Ethiopia, and so on and so forth. But also with Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Indian Americans, as well as Arabs, Palestinians, and Egyptians, and Moroccans, and Jordanians, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, and really from my interactions with them, I feel very um, I feel very welcome, and very the rapport really is genuine. Not to say that we don't have a few knuckleheads here and there, and that's you find that in every community, but generally, so I think those um, those qualities, or let me say those parts of my circumstance, the community by and large seem to have been very receptive to. You know, so yeah, that's why I said I'm not a very traditional imam, so to speak. And of course, I never pretend to be a scholar or anything like that. I consider myself to be a student of knowledge, still studying, still learning. But that's a lifelong thing.
Us living in America, there's always the Desi Masjid with the Desi Imam, and then there's the Arab Masjid with the Arab Imam. So it's very rare to see kind of a mix where there's a mixed masjid and also an Imam who doesn't match the majority demographic of the masjid. So going to your journey on that point, is that a lot of people, we know the tradition of India, we know the tradition of Al Azhar, we know the tradition of Deoband, we know the tradition of Medina and Saudi and the Gulf in general. Tell us a little bit about the Nigerian tradition, what you were brought up in, whether it's the tasawwuf, whether it's just the fiqh that you guys follow, and just the vibe and the feel of growing up over there. It's something that I feel like we don't see that much in imams.
So Nigeria has a very, very rich Islamic, traditional Islamic scholarship going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And so, because people tend to, when they talk of Nigeria, they tend to, the Islamic timeline tends to start with the jihad of Usman Dan Fodio. But Dan Fodio comes from a long line of scholars, the scholarly families. And there was great scholars way before Usman Dan Fodio. And there have been great scholars, after that. Of course, the history of Islam in Nigeria, Islam most likely came into Nigeria around the 11th century, um, into the Borno area, which is again where this Boko Haram extremist group comes from. But that's the earliest entrant of Islam into Nigeria. But more prominently, as a big community, it was from around the 1600s that you had established. You started to have kings who would convert to Islam, um, like Emir Rumfa in Kano, for example. And Kano is considered, I believe, is the most ancient city in Nigeria, which is in northern Nigeria. The largest city in northern Nigeria is a city with very rich Islamic history. And you have many other cities like that that have long histories of Islam, like Bida, which is my hometown. Cities like Katsina, cities like Zaria, cities like Maiduguri, and so forth, and Sokoto. So we've had this long history of Islam, and people have written a lot. Scholars have written a lot, and we use Arabic, but also Ajami, which is a style of writing that uses Arabic letters to write our local languages. So you will see someone write or documents where a letter or a document is written in Hausa language, for instance, but using Arabic letters, and that's called Ajami. I remember, for instance, when I was young, seeing my uncle sending a letter to someone, and that letter was in Nupe, which is my mother tongue, but it was written in Arabic letters. So you would see Arabic writing, but the language is not Arabic, and that's called Ajami. So you had that tradition. Now, of course, Islam was spread in West Africa mostly through Tasawwuf and through Muslim traders who would come. There you had the trans-Saharan trade, because of course before the Europeans came and drew lines and the countries together, you had Muslim empires that stretched over various countries, present day countries. So is it the Mali Empire or the Songhai Empire, and so forth. And parts of Nigeria were part of some of these empires. Like my part of Nigeria, or just slightly north of it, was part of the Songhai Empire, for instance. So some parts of Nigeria, Islam came there through Mali, for instance. And so you had Tasawwuf, and you had largely was dominated by the Qadiriyya, which was named after Sheikh Abdul Qadir al Jilani, and then later you have the Tijaniya, named after Sheikh Ahmad al Tijani. So you had these, a lot of the great scholars even who came to Nigeria, although some of them I will say were they held very, very stringent hardline views, like um, Abdul Karim. There was an Algerian scholar who had gone to Songhai, gone to Kano, Al Magili, Abdul Karim Al Magili, for example. They were jurists themselves, but they had uh, um, they had Sufi turuk that they followed as well. Even Sheikh Usman Dan Fodio, who is a great reformer of Islam in northern Nigeria, who established Sokoto Caliphate, he was a sheikh of the Qadiriya Sufi Tariqa. His son Muhammad Bello was of the Tijaniya Sufi Tariqa. So the Sufis, in their trade and business, they set up institutions. They were, you cannot deny their contribution. Then, of course, later on, we had the more Salafi or Wahhabi, quote unquote, influence that started coming in, particularly, I believe, in the around the early mid 70s or so. And then when you started to have people go to Saudi Arabia to study and come back, and then so here you had now an emergence of a more Salafi strand, uh, embodied by an organization or movement called the Izalatul Bid'ah wa Iqamat Sunnah organization. And so he had a lot of polemics and clashes and things like that. So within all of this, of course, my dad, his shuyukh were they belonged to, they had the Sufi background, though he himself, uh, as far as I know, never really took a tariqa per se, but sometimes we'll go to wazaif and do adhkar together with, but all that while, even as a young boy, I would ask him certain questions. And he will say, well, when you hear people arguing, never make a conclusion, listen to only one side. Listen to the arguments and the proofs of one side. Listen to the arguments. So don't be afraid to read widely. And some things he will say, oh, Bashir, when you get older, you will make your own conclusion on these things. But I always found him to have been very balanced. And even though he associated more with the from the Sufi, shuyukh, there were certain things that he used to criticize, a lot, even within that tradition. So it was not like a blind following. So that, for me, that orientation really guided me a lot throughout. And so you can see, for instance, even some of the scholars that I mentioned that have been of influence to me, you can see that there are people that you find that balance with them, right? Classical one I would like to give, for example, is someone like Sheikh Mukhtar. I used to say that, after getting to know him, I used to say about Sheikh Mukhtar Mughrawi that uh, it's easy for a Sufi to call him a Salafi, and it's easy for a Salafi to call him a Sufi, because you saw that balance in him. He had a lot of wara, a lot of, zuhud, and yet powerful intellectual, and so there was that balance. And in Nigeria, of course, there are things that you just grew up, we grow up knowing fiqh, fundamental fiqh quite well. We grow up in the milieu of tafsir. Nigeria, and to some degree West Africa, is the only place I know where, like in Ramadan, all the shuyukh, they close all of the books. Ramadan is a month of tafsir. So they're doing tafsir, they have a qari sitting next to the sheikh, and the qari is reciting, and the sheikh is doing the tafsir. Qari is reciting, sheikh is doing the tafsir. So they do that every day during Ramadan, and then when the Ramadan comes to an end, they close the tafsir book. Next Ramadan, they continue where they left off. So you find it may take a sheikh maybe 25 years, 30 years to do a khatam to complete the tafsir, and then they start again. So we grow up with that kind of tradition, and you grow basically, listening to mufassirun and shuyukh and things, just on your everyday Muslim kind of thing. And of course, for the more serious students or students of knowledge who are learning directly from these shuyukh, then you're getting a more serious sort of orientation. So basically, that's the kind of environment I grew up in, and that it is still quite vibrant in Nigeria. With that.
So that is the side with kind of the maslak, the manhaj. When it comes to fiqh, has it been a little bit less changing? I'm guessing it's mainly Maliki fiqh. Has that kind of been changed in the last 50 or so years, or has that mostly been not stagnant, but just consistent throughout this time as well?
I would say that it's been pretty much consistent. The Maliki madhab is very strong in Nigeria, as it is the madhab of North Africa and West Africa, primarily. And so throughout the scholars and those through whom Islam came to Nigeria were Malikis, and that's what they learned. And um, it became basically the fiqh upon which the legal system was based during the time of the Islamic caliphates, the Sokoto Caliphate, as well as the Kanem Borno Empire. So the court will rule according to the Maliki law, and so on and so forth. And even with the introduction of Salafism into Nigeria in the from the late 70s or thereabouts, even with that, yes, there were introductions of a bit of Hanbalism, right? Due to that influence from Saudi Arabia, people who went to Saudi Arabia or studied with those sheikhs, or the rise in awareness of some of the influence of Saudi sheikhs like Sheikh bin Baz and Nasruddin Al Albani, etc. So you had these strains that basically would challenge some of the conventional, uh, Maliki understanding on some finer things of fiqh and things like that. But by and large, the Maliki fiqh has remained very stable. One reason being that it is when qadis study in the law schools and Sharia law schools, whether they're um, I- Islamic religious institutions or they're secular institutions where they study Sharia law as well, it's based on the Maliki madhab. So the codes in Nigeria, the penal code, etc., is based on the Maliki. So even if you're Salafi and you have certain views, etc., if you have a dispute with someone and it has to go to a qadi to the court, the judge is gonna judge based on the Maliki madhab. So you find that even Salafi scholars in Nigeria, some prominent Salafi scholars, they will tell you they're the way Maliki in our madhab. Of course, they will time to time veer away from the Maliki madhab on some issues, but by and large, the madhab in Nigeria is basically Maliki. So that's just how it is, and I think there's even now some growing appreciation even for the Maliki madhab, because Imam Malik's methodology I find to be very interesting. I think is very it's a maqasidi kind of paradigm, and I think it's a very Quran centric paradigm in that he had a filtering system where he didn't just accept every ahad hadith, and he considered the Amal Ahlul Madina. Basically, he gave it the status of Sahih Hadith, or even gave it the status of Tawatur. And so that that gave some kind of a filter and standard by which now there was more room to do ijtihad, so long as it was to the benefit of considerations of masalih al mursala, the public good, and so it has that holistic sense, and it involves intellectual ijtihad, and basically when we talk of fiqh of context, and fiqh of priorities, I think that really it started early on with these calls with Imam Abu Hanifa, with Imam Malik, you know, um, in contrast really to Imam Shafi and Imam Ahmed, because Malik, for instance, had the unique, I would say, profile that he was a faqih and a muhaddith, and he was respected by both groups. I think none of the four, of course, there were more than four imams, but the ones whose schools of thought basically endured, none of the four was seen as a master of both, as a faqih, and when I say this, of course, is relative, right? Of course, they were fuqaha, etc. But when they, if others consider them to be, oh, you're the master faqih, and then you're a master muhaddith, it wasn't like that. Abu Hanifa was seen more as a stronger as a faqih than a muhaddith. Imam Shafi would probably have been considered as a stronger as a faqih probably than a muhaddith. I mean, his risala set in rules of usul and things like that, masterpiece. Imam Ahmad, a lot of the earlier scholars even did not consider him to be faqih. They considered him to be a muhaddith. But Imam Malik combined both, so you could see the the manifestation of that in his methodology and in his school. And I think that it's one of the things that helped it to endure, in those areas, and that makes it appealing, especially to Muslims in minority areas. Even though in some issues, Imam Malik's school can turn out to be very very hardcore and stringent on certain other issues. But yeah, uh, Nigeria is still is dominantly Maliki, even among Salafi scholars. When it is Maliki madhab has basically been institutionalized and is part of that fabric, in Nigeria and much of West Africa.
Obviously, you would know better having studied it more, but from what I've heard, you mentioned Maliki madhab in minority situations, and the Maliki madhab was the predominant madhab in Spain, in Andalus, Spain, because from what I've heard, because of this reason, because it's friendly to minorities, Muslims living when they're just 10-20% of the population, like it was in Spain, perhaps half or less than half of the population was Muslim, and therefore it's easier to adopt a Maliki madhab, and like we've seen in North Africa, right, across the entire thing. Just
And it's a very practical. The Maliki madhab is it's uh it's very practical. It's very experiential. Like it's very real world. It's very applicative, so to speak, right? And that's why Imam Malik, for example, he didn't like hypothetical. People come and throw hypothetical questions, and sometimes someone comes with a question, and he said, "Did that actually happen?" And they say, "No." He said, "When it happens, then you come back to me." As opposed to Imam Abu Hanifa, for example, who basically, would use what they call the Socratic method and just throw a hypothetical situation out to his students, and then they discuss and debate, etc. Then him as a sheikh now comes and basically, facilitates a consensus or a conclusion, and it did that a lot, and that has its advantages as well. It's probably why the Hanafi madhab is the most advanced when it comes to issues to do with Islamic finance and Islam. And you see the relevance and the role of that. In basically when it comes to Islamic finance, etc. It seems as if in modern times most of the other madhab basically gravitate to the Hanafi madhab. So you see the benefits and the different strengths of all the different madahib in certain aspects of Islam and practical life.
that's you coming up in Nigeria and the Maliki madhab, with the Sufi turuq being very common over there. You mentioned the Tijani strand, the Qadiri strand. Now you're in America and you're studying over here, and you come, as you mentioned, you had some studies earlier back in the early 2000s. You go to Nigeria, come back a little bit more recently, and you finish up your PhD. What were you writing on? What is the process like studying religion at a secular university? How do you kind of bring both of them together? And what was your experience like doing your PhD over here?
Yeah, it was quite interesting. My PhD dissertation was on a counter narratives to the Boko Haram extremist ideology or movement. Now, Boko Haram is a popular name that's used for a very infamous extremist, violent extremist group operating mainly in the northeastern part of Nigeria, who at one time even basically colonized certain states and local governments. Local governments in Nigeria is the equivalent of counties. They were under their control and they hoisted their flags there and they killed a lot of people. Now, so I was in Nigeria where when the Boko Haram violence really erupted, and unfortunately, government did not help matters because the way that they handled them was a sort of scorched earth. And what that does is that you kill innocent people as well, and that only does what? It only gives them more population to recruit from. So and so that whole violence really affected the whole country. And I was working with the Dawa Institute in Nigeria, and of course we were very and continue to be very involved in training Islamic workers and preachers and professors and media people and Muslim lawyers and all of that on a lot of contemporary issues in Islam. And so that was one topic that was of concern to us, and we engaged in, and we trained facilitators. Interestingly, some of our facilitators we trained were formerly Boko Haram people, who followed that ideology, but then, with trainings that we gave them, etc., they actually became facilitators, training others against such ideologies, and then training others about the broad principles of Islam, basic things about fiqh and basic things about usul and about maqasid and qawaid of fiqh, and to give people a general bird's eye sort of understanding of Islam, so that there's a there when you have a holistic understanding, even if that doesn't necessarily make you a scholar, it gives you an appreciation of the scholar's mind, of the jurist's mind, and of the when you understand the maqasid, the goals, you know, of Sharia, then you are able to have a sort of a measure, a sort of a standard by which you even assess fatwas of scholars or views of others, and maybe you are able to see, okay, what makes sense in certain context, what doesn't make sense, or what makes more sense, or what is more practical, in certain contexts. So it gives you that kind of a jurist paradigm. So being involved in all of that, and then of course this is a real issue in Nigeria. That's what really got me interested in doing research in that area, something that will be hopefully relevant. And so I embarked on that. It's similar to my master's thesis. So I just expanded in my PhD dissertation on that. Of course, you know, I had to do research and write about the history of Islam in Nigeria, the history of Islamic social reform movements, the movement of, Usman Dan Fodio, for example, and Sheikh Muhammad Amin Al Kanami of the Kanam Borno, and some of the impact of scholars like Abdul Karim Al Magili, for example, in West Africa, in Nigeria, and parts of what were the Songhai Empire, etc. And then tracing more recent times, the Metatsine. Metatsine actually is a group. Metatsine means that it's a name basically describing someone who's cursing people, and because they used to curse people who did not agree with their views, and they were an extremist group. But that is where basically the seeds of Boko Haram were planted. So when the Boko Haram emerged, there are different sort of sources, if you will, of what became generally called Boko Haram. There was a recruitment based on ideology, which was propounded by the founder of Boko Haram, Muhammad Yusuf, who was very charismatic, very charismatic speaker. But of course, he espoused the idea that any form of authority or government that is not Islamic is taghut. And if it is taghut, anyone who agrees with such a system is kafir because it's a kufr system. So that way, they basically made takfir of other Muslims. And they concluded that if they're kafir, then their blood is legitimate to spill, right? And using the ayat to safe, and then of course their concept of of nasakh, right? That all the verses that have to do with peaceful relations with people of other faiths, etc., they believe that all of them are mansukha, and so there should just be a relationship of war, of forced conversion, etc., etc., which of course flies at the face of the dominant understanding of Islam over the centuries. I say dominant because there have been others in historically who've held these kinds of views, but these have been minorities. The dominant view has been that lakum dinukum waliyadin. Dominant view has been قاتلوا الذين يقاتلونكم قاتلوا في سبيل الله الذين يقاتلونكم ولا تعتدوا. You can fight in self-defense those who fight against you, but don't be the aggressor. They say all of these verses they are mansukha, and so so that was their ideology, and they were ready to actually implement that. So and that is where I think even if people get criticized for saying things like this, some of the really hardcore, hardline, quote unquote Salafi or quote unquote Wahhabi interpretations basically had similar conclusions. They just brought you to the brink, and then if someone just put all that together, then they just went off the edge. But the ideology was the same, and I think this is a legitimate critique. This is a legitimate critique. Um, I think that there were a lot of benefit also that the Salafi movement brought, in that it became, they kind of established a kind of standard where people had to be, when you come and you quote hadith, etc. Okay, is it sahih? Is it, that kind of, bringing that kind of discourse, I think was very helpful because it helped to sort of standardize interpretations, hermeneutics, etc. And I think it generated and ignited a lot of intellectual, debate and resource, which I think ultimately is been beneficial. It continues up till today, anyways. So, and then of course, doing my PhD in a Western university, one may wonder why you're gonna come to America to come and do Islamic studies, etc. But of course, having done some elementary school here, having done high school here, I graduated high school here in America in Philadelphia, Sister Clara Muhammad School. Um, I kind of had exposure to all of these anyway growing up, and I've been exposed for a long time to understanding and explaining Islam to people who are not Muslim. So the kind of normal criticism of Islam, misconceptions about Islam, there were things I was very familiar with, which for many, for instance, whose only exposure is the like an Islamic school, curriculum, or the madrasa bubble, if you will, that they're all within that madrasa, and it's an echo chamber, and there is no critique, or you just accept everything, and you come out to the real world, and then you're being bombarded by all these potentially faith shaking questions, shaken, even, they're attacking the Quran, the authenticity of Quran, they're attacking the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the ahadith and all of that, and you're absolutely not prepared for that, people's reaction can either be to shut that and not engage with it out of fear, or just dismissing it, or they succumb to it and basically, they lay prostrate, to it, and then that's where you start seeing people who, I've heard cases of Hufad even doing ridda, for example, becoming atheists, for instance. So I was exposed early on to that kind of critique, and also from up, I think about the age of maybe about 12, 11, 12 or so, that's when I started listening to Ahmed Didat and engaging in debates, polemics, debates with Christians, for example, from that age. So I was used to always having a critical mind, always, understanding when, what's the kernel, what's the meat and potatoes of an issue. When is it that you've answered a question? When is it that you haven't really answered the question? So I basically grew up with that kind of intellectual, orientation. So studying Islam in a secular Western institution was not that big a deal for me. Thankfully, my major professors were also Muslim, but that didn't mean that issues were not discussed, and because you're studying religion as an academic discipline. It's not you're not studying as a religionist. You're studying as a reductionist for the most part, where there's openness to critique, and you have to be able to respond to these intellectually, not from a point of view of emotion or from a point of view of because I am Muslim, but there has to be, it has to meet minimum standards of scrutiny that even a non-Muslim can look at and say, okay, yes, your point here stands, or they disagree, but then they cannot say that your work is based solely on sentiment or bias. We all have biases, and that's one of the things I teach my students. When I was teaching at University of Georgia, teaching religion and introduction to the Western religious traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The first month is basically to teach them about bias, either explicit bias or implicit bias. We all have biases. We all come from different religious backgrounds or non religious backgrounds. So some are Christian, Jewish, atheist, secularist, Muslim, Buddhist, and so forth, and that we should acknowledge and recognize that we have biases, and there's nothing wrong with having biases. That's just part of being human, but we should know and acknowledge that there are biases. Other people have their biases as well, and we should try and be objective in our interpretation, hermeneutics, and our understanding of religion or of any subject matter. And also the fact that I had to teach Judaism, I had to teach Christianity, I had to teach Islam. So my comparative religion background was very helpful, even though in a university setting, it's not polemics. It's not, you're not trying to convert anyone. You're teaching these as academic, subjects, but you had to have a very good grasp and understanding of what you were teaching. Because imagine I am a Muslim professor teaching Jewish students about Judaism, teaching Christian students about Christianity, teaching everybody about Islam, etc. So the understanding and appreciation of these religious traditions had to be such that even those who believe and adhere to it cannot accuse you of not knowing what you're talking about, and cannot accuse you of being biased. But when you basically teach all three, they themselves are left to make comparisons. And I used to get very wonderful, wonderful pattern reflection papers from my students, because the last assignment they do is to just write a reflection paper, and I used to be so moved by the kind of reflections that they shared as to what they learned, how much they didn't know about their own faiths, how much they didn't know about Islam, etc. And there was nothing more satisfying to me than that. So back to my dissertation, I basically wrote on the Boko Haram what were some of the causes of their extremism and violence, the causes having to do with ideology, but also socioeconomic factors as well. Um, they see failed government, they see corrupt politicians, they see poverty. Then you have illiteracy. Nigeria is a very, very mineral rich country with petrochemicals, with solid minerals, with gold, and in all of that. But then it consistently ranks very high in the poverty index, especially the northern part of Nigeria, which I come from, which is the Muslim dominated areas of Nigeria. So when they see all of these, young people see this, and they have a scholar or a preacher who is telling them, well, this is all because you're in a Tagut government, right? So they basically make that connection, and then they become easy recruits into such movements. So that is not being much spoken about, that factor, which I believe is even a stronger factor than the ideology. Um, the corruption of the leaders, of the politicians, and they're living very flamboyant lives, whereas people are starving, in the same country. And I think that's an area that needs to be looked into, as well as the fact of foreign governments and foreign players instigating these conflicts in Africa, so that they can continue to exploit the natural resources, so that they can come in and say, "Oh, our government is going to help you with troops, our military, to help you secure your country." Meanwhile, the real aim is to be there so that they can exploit the natural mineral, resources in connivance with people in the governments, because they are corrupt and they are being enriched and stuff. So there are a lot of dynamics to this whole Boko Haram thing. You would be shocked to learn that there were people, Boko Haram fighters, who were caught who were not even Muslim. They were not Muslim. It was all contract. They were just mercenaries, and they were making money. A gentleman, well, I won't say gentle, but a man who was caught, who was a supplier of, I think, fuel, for instance, was caught one time. He was not Muslim. He was from the southern part of the country, and he was a Christian actually. Some of them who were captured didn't even weren't they didn't know how to recite Quran, for example. And these are supposed to be the people in a movement that is saying they want to establish Islamic law and things like. It's so contradictory. So there are many, many, sort of dynamics with this whole Boko Haram thing. And it's an industry, sadly in Nigeria, and it has cost thousands and thousands of lives. And now they're basically they're resurgent, currently in Nigeria, sadly. So that's a bit about what my dissertation subject was about, and I also looked at what have been the responses of Muslim scholars in Nigeria to them. Some who actually ended up being assassinated by Boko Haram, and some of the prominent people who even opposed them were Salafi scholars. You know, some who were assassinated, like Sheikh Jafar Mahmoud Adam, Sheikh Muhammad Adam Awal, who was known as Albani because he's a big Sheikh Al Albani has been a big him, so he's called Albani of Zaria. They assassinated him too, right? They made attempts at the Amir of Kano, who is also a prominent Muslim scholar himself, and an economist, and was a central bank governor. They made attempts at him, and they made attempts at the former Amir of Kano as well, Ado Bayero. So, and then organizations also that were working to counter the Boko Haram narrative, and this is where the organization I worked with, the Dawa Institute, came in, and I cited all of that work as well in countering the Boko Haram narrative.
So that brings you from maybe Brother Bashir or Imam Bashir to Dr. Bashir. mashallah. And now you are here as the Imam at what's called Islamic Center. Just take me through, we went through your childhood, kind of how the situation was Islamically wise in Nigeria, some of your education and upbringing, now kind of current day, just what you're doing as Imam here, current projects, studies, and just future plans for the next few years.
So as imam here, I'm doing the basic functions of an imam, leading salat, leading prayers, giving lectures. I do a weekly Quran nights where we basically do reflections on the Quran, because I have a lot of passion for the Quran, alhamdulillah. And uh, we have classes going on for new Muslims every second weekend, every second Sunday of the week, because we've had a lot of people joining, coming to take Shahada, accepting Islam. And of recent, it's almost on a weekly basis, someone's at least taking Shahada. During Ramadan, there was a day when we had 5 Shahadas in one day, mashallah. Literally from the time of Fajr, right after Fajr, 2 young men walked in. They wanted to take Shahada. About an hour so later, someone walked in, wanted to take Shahada. By the end of the day, we had given 5 Shahadas, to people. And of course, even yesterday we had a Shahada in the masjid. So we have these classes for new Muslims, teaching them the basics. It's called Islam 101, the fundamentals. So they learn the fundamentals of the deen, how to make salat, learn the basics of the 5 pillars. We have a forum to answer questions, for them. And then it's also a forum for them to connect with other new Muslims as well as other Muslims, because in the class, it's not just people who took Shahada. There are people who have been born Muslim, but they want to, improve their knowledge about the basics of Islam. Other things that we do, of course, are community events at the masjid. Typically, about monthly, we have community nights, and there's a lot going on with the Sunday school and the after school program for students who they come and they learn Islam and Quran. We have a full time Hifz program. MashaAllah, we've graduated Hifz students here, some of who are even leading us during Taraweeh in Ramadan. And of course, I part of my duty, of course, also is to lead janaza prayers and lead funerals. And we happen to be the closest masjid to the only Muslim cemetery in our county or in our area. So a lot of times the janazas are held in masjid, even for people who come from different parts of the city. And that's been one of the interesting experiences I've had, because it was when I came here that I actually first led janaza prayer. I've always participated in them, and then I came here to this masjid as imam during COVID, and of course there was a lot of janazas in COVID time, and at some point it started to, I think, affect me emotionally. Even there was just death so much all the time. um, and I also advise people who have issues they need advice from youth, advising them on life issues, some of them on spouse selection issues. I advise, married people as well, who are having issues. They need advice. They need to come and talk to Imam, etc. So I do a lot of that, not just in person, but also remotely on the phone, etc. And I partake in the board meetings of the masjid and represent the community in other uh, events and fora, whether they're interfaith or things where we're having collaboration with, say, for example, the sheriff's department, or the Cobb County Sheriff, or the board of commissioners representing the masjid and the community in some of these events, and some activism, etc. And of course, learning never stops. Right now I'm taking courses on maqasid and on Quranic tafsir, for example, with the Maqasid Institute, which is headed by Dr. Zaid Barazinji, and of course founded by Sheikh Professor Jasir Auda. So I'm learning a lot of things, and I'm able to engage on different cutting edge issues, basically. And I'm looking forward to publishing my dissertation, readying it for publication, inshallah. That is one of my big goals for the coming year, inshallah. So make dua for me that I'm able to do that. And so these are some of the things I'm engaged in. And of course, I wear different hats on, I'm part of different bodies. So I'm, and boards as well, such as Ihsan Foundation for West Africa. I consult and advise them and support them. And recently, I became a member of the board of Save Institute, which is here in Atlanta, which is an educational institute founded by, a brother, mashallah, very passionate about educating young boys, especially from the African American, community, in a very practical, experiential and expeditionary manner, where they actually given orientation that's very, very holistic, not just learning about the deen, but learn to be entrepreneurs, learning to be agropreneurs, and so on and so forth. So that is something I'm quite excited about partaking in. That, I've back home in Nigeria, I'm a part owner of a school, an Islamically oriented school with some friends of mine, Inspire Academy in Abuja. So when it comes to education, especially for youth, I've been involved for quite a long time, in that area. So it's something that usually excites me. So yes, these are some of the things that I'm doing. Alhamdulillah.
MashaAllah, have your hand in a lot of different projects over here. MashaAllah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept. Sheikh,
And
to wind down the podcast, I'm going to have a quick fire round. I want to get your thoughts on some questions. You said that you follow the Maliki madhab, which is predominant in the area, Nigeria and North Africa. Who are your top three Maliki scholars of all time?
well, of course, Imam Malik.
Of course, other than Imam Malik.
Other than Imam Malik, I admire a lot Ibn Rushd, the author of Bidayat al-Mujtahid wa Nihayat al-Muqtasid, which is a very excellent work on comparative fiqh. Some of my top Maliki scholars are scholars not famous really as jurists, but as thinkers. So among them will obviously be Abdurrahman ibn Khaldun. I'm a really big fan of Ibn Khaldun. And then Amir Abdul Qadir al Jazairi, really a big hero of mine. I'm a really big fan. And actually, during my PhD, I wrote a paper. I wrote a paper on Amir Abdul Qadir, al Jazairi. It was very, very fascinating person, basically to learn about. And of course, one that I learned from it, because this is just practical, is of course Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani, of course, who has one of the primary texts that is studied in Maliki fiqh in North Africa and in West Africa. But there are some contemporary Maliki scholars that are great scholars that I really, really admire a lot and respect a lot. Top on that list for me will be a current living scholar, Maulana Sheikh Sharif Ibrahim Saleh Al Husseini, who is, in the view of many people, the greatest scholar perhaps in West Africa, certainly in Nigeria. And he's a well regarded and respected scholar globally, and very prolific. Has written hundreds of books, a real scholar, basically. So I would say these are some of the names that I would mention as being favorites of mine.
MashaAllah,
Uh,
MashaAllah. What is your favorite book that you have studied?
Um, that's a very good question. But I would say I don't know if I can say that I have a favorite per se. But I know some books that have had impact on me, and interestingly, one of them is not even by a Maliki scholar, and that will be Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, his Halal al Haram for Islam. I think for me it was very influential in that in the introduction he laid out basically these principles, usuli and maqasidi sort of principles that I think have even been extracted and made into a booklet themselves. So I think that was very influential for me. And I really like Bidayatul Mujtahid. I think it was very, I found it to expand my scope of understanding and appreciation for looking at issues, fiqh issues, etc., from different perspectives. So I think those probably stand out for me. You know.
Is it true in the Maliki madhab that you guys pray 36 rak'ahs of Tarawih? And if it is, then did you ever do it in Nigeria? And what is the reason why?
So I never did it in Nigeria. Uh, I think this was early on, really, in that of course you have this whole controversy of how many rakahs in Taraweeh, etc., etc. And there was a time um, when people pray Taraweeh, particularly in Mecca, and then they will rest in between and they will do tawaf. They'll do tawaf during that rest in between. And so you had others in other areas, okay, we're not in Mecca, we can do tawaf. So instead of that resting, we'll pray extra rakahs. So that's why you had some will pray 20 rakahs and then you had some praying, 36 rakahs. I never prayed 36 rakahs in Taraweeh. Mostly in Nigeria, we would pray 13 rakahs, you know, 13 rakahs. That is including the Shafa and Witr. Um, that's mostly what I grew up doing in Nigeria. So we prayed the 10 rakas and then the shafa water, 2+1. Actually, it was in America, I think, that I ever prayed 20 rakas, of water. So could it have been that, later Maliki just got lazier or took it easier on people, etc. Wallahu alam. But that era of 36 rakas, and I don't think it is widely done, at least in Nigeria. I don't know if other West African countries or other of North African countries. I don't know that it is widely done, like that. It is here in America really that I was even introduced to actually praying 20 rakas, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
I mean, I can barely do 20. I don't know how 36 is just. I hear that in some places. I don't know. Maybe you know better in Algeria and in Morocco.
Mm.
Just here and there, they might do
They
36
might, but the
Sundays.
thing is that those records will be shorter.
Very short.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they will be shorter. They're lighter, on
Yeah.
people. So even here, where we do 8 records, for example, they tend to be long,
Yeah.
etc. And we live in an age where people don't have the patience for that anymore, or the focus, or the concentration. Their minds are on too many things, may Allah accept this ibadat from us.
I mean,
No.
you've traveled many places, but what is one country that you want to travel to that you haven't been to yet?
I really would love to go to Turkey. Course, I've just traveled through an airport. I've never, so Turkey has so much in terms of history and culture and so much. But from a Muslim perspective, there's so much Islamic history in Turkey. And then being a student of comparative religion as well, right? You go back the Roman era, the Christian, the Byzantine era. There's just so much in Turkey that I would love to go and explore, in Turkey. So I think for me, top might be Turkey. Yes.
And even you talked about Ibn Khaldun. Over there, they have Ibn Khaldun
Yeah,
University
Ibn
over there
Khaldun
in Turkey.
Actually, that was a university I was considering to go to when I came back here. I was considering to go to Ibn Khaldun because when I looked at their curriculum, I was like, "Wow, this is perfect for
Mm,
me." And then my sheikh is also in Turkey now. He's in Istanbul. Sheikh Muhtar. He has a sohbah program, and he's doing something actually in collaboration with Ibn Khaldun, university. So, my next trip to Nigeria that I'm planning, inshallah, on my way back, I plan to spend at least one day doing a quick tour of Turkey and hopefully go and greet my sheikh as well.
inshallah.
Um,
Send us some pictures then, inshallah.
inshallah.
Dr. Bashir, what is your closing advice for all of the students of knowledge out there?
Um, well, number one is to be very broad minded in their search for knowledge. It is also to uh, seek balance in their search for knowledge and to not have a taqleed, a blind taqleed to any one person or individual, especially not on every matter. There are great scholars that we admire and we learn and take knowledge from them, but no one individual is a repository of all knowledge. You will find that for me, I've been impacted a lot by scholars from a variety of leanings. Some of them are more Sufi oriented, some are more Salafi oriented. Some are activist scholars, some are pacifist scholars. So to basically, take knowledge that is beneficial and be balanced and also practical and also appreciate the universalities in Islam and seek in Islam that universality that allows Islam to be meaningful in terms of people's lives in whatever situation or condition that they are, so that you're able to engage the highly intellectual and the very simple person. You're able to engage very simple situations as well as complex, situations, and you're able also to articulate Islam in a manner that is effective, especially in modern times. This is not to say modernize Islam. It's by the universality of Islam, it is relevant for all ages and for all times, but the way that it is articulated has to be able to address the challenges of its time. If we go back to Islamic history, certain scholars and certain disciplines arose as a way of articulating Islam in a manner that addressed the challenges of those times. So, for example, when scholars who developed theology in Islam came, it was a response to the Mu'tazilite, for example. So they had to articulate Islam in a manner, in a fashion, with the reference point, with the kind of vocabulary that spoke to that particular, challenge. When Imam Al Ghazali, Abu Hamid Al Ghazali, one of my favorite scholars of all time, one of the real goats, if goats, greatest of all time. Um, you know, becoming a well respected figure in understanding philosophy and understanding the Aristotelian philosophy and all of that, and then to come and counter it, right? So he had to reach a level where even in that field, the experts in those areas could not they couldn't just shove you aside and say you don't know what you're talking about. You actually understand it. So I think this is the challenge really of our time. I think that there are some things that by and large have been settled in Islam. Some of them have to do with some of the basic fiqh, issues. And there are some areas where we still need a lot of work to be done, a lot of research to be done, and Alhamdulillah, we see hope, and seeing scholars and institutions, rising up to the challenge. But yeah, this will be my advice that, be broad minded, and understand Islam in a comprehensive manner, and also drop this sort of mental dichotomy. We need specialists, of course, in Islam, but we can't have effective mujtahids, scholars, and fuqaha who have no knowledge of other things. So we need fuqaha who are biochemists, and fuqaha who are, linguists, and fuqaha who are medical doctors and physicians. This is how it used to be. I mean, I mentioned Ibn Rushd, for example. He was also, he was also a physician. He was a philosopher. He was a jurist. He was a judge. And things like that. So this broad disciplinary sort of training and orientation is very, very important. Yeah. So these are, some pieces of advice that I would have for people, for Muslims and activists and young people.
Dr. Bashir, Jazakallahu khairan. We pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He accepts all of the efforts that you've put forth in the deen and puts barakah in all of your current studies. Jazakallahu khairan.
I mean, thank you very much for the opportunity to share and reflect.
Anytime, inshallah. And maybe next time after we have your dissertation published, we'll come back and talk about it in a year or something.
Inshallah.
Jazakallahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaykum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.